The first time they ignored me was at my husband's funeral. Not openly. Not cruelly. Just quietly enough that no one else noticed. I was standing beside the coffin, my fingers numb, my chest hollow, when his sister leaned toward their aunt and whispered something. They both nodded. Then they stepped slightly away from me. Just enough to form a circle that didn't include me. I remember thinking how strange it was, how grief can make people reveal themselves. Have you ever been surrounded by people and still felt completely erased? If you've ever been pushed aside during the worst moment of your life, hit that like button. This story is for you. And if someone tried to take advantage of you when you were at your weakest, share your story in the comments. You're not alone here. My name is Raina. I was 34 years old when my husband Daniel died unexpectedly. No warning. No long illness. Just a phone call that split my life into before and after. Daniel and I had been married for 6 years. We weren't flashy. We weren't loud. We built a quiet, steady life. Shared routines, inside jokes, long walks after dinner. We talked about the future in practical ways. Retirement accounts. Travel plans. Maybe children. His family always said I was reserved. What they meant was, I didn't compete for attention. From the beginning, Daniel's family had been polite, cordial, smiling, but never warm. His mother, Eleanor, ran the family like a boardroom. His sister, Marissa, followed her lead. They spoke in decisions, not conversations. I was always introduced as Daniel's wife, never just Raina. At the funeral, Eleanor held herself together beautifully. Black dress, perfect posture, dry eyes. I was the one shaking. People kept telling me, be strong, as if strength was something you could switch on. After the service, I was guided, not asked, to sit in a side room. Someone pressed tea into my hands. Someone else took my phone so I could rest. That should have been my first warning. I didn't know then that while I was being protected from the world, they were already discussing my future without me. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in the house Daniel and I had shared. I slept on the couch because the bedroom felt unbearable. I woke up to emails. Not condolences. Meetings. A message from Daniel's uncle. Family discussion tomorrow. Important matters to settle. I stared at the screen, confused. Important matters? I hadn't even begun to understand that Daniel was gone. The meeting happened at Eleanor's house. I arrived early. I always did. They arrived together. They didn't ask how I was doing. They started talking about logistics. Daniel would have wanted things handled quickly, Eleanor said calmly. That was when I heard it. Not directly, not cruelly, but clearly enough. They weren't talking with me. They were talking around me, as if my role in Daniel's life had ended with his last breath. Marissa mentioned documents. Eleanor mentioned accounts. Someone mentioned the house. And then Eleanor said the sentence that changed everything. Well, of course, since Raina won't be staying here long. I felt the room tilt. I looked up slowly. What do you mean? She smiled gently. We just assumed you want to go back to your own family. This house has been in our family for decades. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just realized something chilling. They didn't see me as Daniel's wife anymore. They saw me as temporary. And they thought grief had made me weak enough not to notice. They were wrong. The days after that meeting felt unreal. Like I was moving through someone else's life. I was still grieving. Still waking up reaching for Daniel's side of the bed before remembering there was no one there. Still flinching every time my phone rang. Expecting another impossible call. But his family had already shifted into strategy mode. They stopped calling to ask how I was. They started calling to tell me what would happen next. Eleanor sent messages that sounded polite on the surface but felt final underneath. We'll need to inventory Daniel's belongings. It's better if we handle the paperwork for now. You should focus on healing. Healing apparently meant staying out of the way. Marissa showed up at the house one afternoon with boxes. She didn't ask if it was a good time. She just walked in, looked around and said, We'll start with the study. Daniel's study. The room where he worked late nights. Where we planned trips. Where he kept documents he actually trusted me with. I stood in the doorway, stunned. What are you doing? I asked. She didn't look at me. Just organizing. Organizing for whom? She pulled out folders, flipping through them quickly, decisively, like she had a right to every page. That's when I realized something terrifying. They weren't waiting to see what Daniel had wanted. They were assuming. I asked for copies of everything they took. Marissa smiled. Of course. She never sent them. When I followed up, Eleanor replied instead. Let's not overwhelm ourselves with details right now. Details? My life had just collapsed, and they were already minimizing my place in it. I went back through my memories, searching for something solid. Something grounding. Daniel and I had talked about this once. Not in fear, just practicality. He'd said, if anything ever happens to me, everything's straightforward. You're taken care of. I clung to that. But then Eleanor asked me to sign something. She framed it casually. It's just a temporary authorization, she said. So we can manage things efficiently. I read it slowly. Too slowly for her liking. It wasn't temporary. It gave them access. Broad access. Accounts. Records. Decisions. I handed it back. I'm not signing this, I said calmly. The room went cold. Eleanor's smile didn't disappear, but it hardened. I think you're confused, she said. This is standard. No, I replied. It's not. Marissa sighed dramatically. Raina, no one is trying to take anything from you. That was the moment I understood. If no one was trying to take anything, why were they pushing so hard? From that day on, the tone changed. They stopped pretending. Conversations happened without me. Decisions were made before I was informed. I found out about appointments, meetings, and plans secondhand. They even started referring to me as Daniel's widow instead of Daniel's wife. It sounded subtle. It wasn't. Widow sounded like an ending. One evening, a neighbor pulled me aside. I didn't know you were moving, she said gently. I felt my heart drop. I'm not. She hesitated. Eleanor mentioned you'd be going back to your parents. She said the house would be empty soon. That lie landed heavier than anything else so far. 'Cause now they weren't just making plans. They were rewriting my story for other people. I confronted Eleanor on the phone. Calmly. Directly. I'm not moving, I said. And I'd appreciate it if you stopped telling people that I am. There was a pause. Then she said, we're just trying to make things easier for everyone. Everyone. Not me. After that call, I stopped reacting emotionally. I started paying attention. I noticed how often they spoke about me instead of to me. How they used phrases like for her own good. And she's not in the right headspace. How they subtly questioned my stability whenever I disagreed. They weren't just trying to control assets. They were trying to control perception. And perception, I realized, was their real weapon. That's when I made a decision. I would grieve. But I would not disappear. I started gathering my own information. Bank statements. Emails. Old documents Daniel and I had shared. Notes he'd left. Conversations we'd had that suddenly mattered more than ever. I didn't accuse. I didn't warn. I prepared. Because something told me this wasn't just about money. It was about power. And they thought grief had made me too fragile to fight back. They didn't know that grief had sharpened me. Grief does something strange to time. Days blur. Nights stretch. Your body moves forward while your mind keeps circling the same moments again and again. Daniel's laugh. His habits. The way he used to leave his keys in the wrong place and smile when I found them. But underneath that fog, something else was happening. I was becoming alert. When people think you're broken, they stop being careful. They assume you're not paying attention. That was their mistake. I started with the basics. Not because I suspected something dramatic yet, but because I needed stability. Facts. Paper. Proof. I requested copies of every account Daniel and I shared. I went through old emails we'd sent each other. I searched drawers I'd never had reason to open before. I checked cloud folders he'd once mentioned casually, like they were nothing important. And slowly a picture began to form. Daniel was meticulous. More meticulous than his family ever gave him credit for. He documented things. Conversations. Decisions. Changes. He kept records not out of fear but out of habit. The same habit that made him plan for the future quietly, without announcements. One night while going through an old external drive, I found a folder labeled simply, "If something happens." My hand shook as I opened it. Inside were scanned documents, notes in Daniel's handwriting, and a short video message dated 2 years earlier. I didn't watch the video yet. I wasn't ready. Instead, I read. There were copies of legal documents. Not final ones, but drafts. Correspondence with a lawyer I'd never heard of. Notes about updating beneficiaries. About protecting me from unnecessary interference. That phrase stood out. Unnecessary interference. Daniel knew. Not everything, but enough. I cross-checked dates. Around the same time these documents were created, Eleanor had pushed hard to be added as an emergency contact on several accounts. She'd framed it as practical, family responsibility, safety. Daniel had resisted. Politely, quietly. I could see it now in the emails. The careful wording. The boundaries he tried to set without causing a scene. They hadn't liked that. And now that he was gone, those boundaries were gone too. Or so they thought. The next thing I discovered made my stomach drop. An account I'd never been told about had recent activity. Not suspicious transfers yet, but inquiries. Requests. Someone had been trying to access it. Someone using family credentials. That was no longer grief territory. That was intent. I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer. Not the family's lawyer. Not someone Eleanor recommended. My own. I walked into that office calm, composed, prepared. I laid everything out. The documents, the emails, the behavior, the lies about me moving, the pressure to sign things. The lawyer listened without interrupting. Then he said something that confirmed what I had begun to fear. They're not confused, he said. They're positioning. That word stayed with me. Positioning. He explained it carefully. How, in moments of loss, families sometimes move quickly to establish control. How they justify it as protection. How questioning a widow's stability is a common tactic. Especially if they believe she won't push back, he added. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead I asked, what do I do? He leaned back. You stay quiet. You document everything. And you don't sign anything without me. So that's what I did. I stopped arguing with Eleanor. Stopped correcting Marissa. Stopped reacting when they spoke over me. And because I stopped resisting openly, they got bolder. They requested meetings with banks. They contacted advisors. They tried to present themselves as decision makers. They assumed I wouldn't notice. But every move they made left a trail. Emails. Phone logs. Requests. Claims they couldn't substantiate. One afternoon Eleanor called me, her tone unusually soft. We're just worried about you, she said. You seem detached. I knew what that was. A test. I'm handling things, I replied calmly. She paused. We just want to make sure you don't do anything you'll regret. There it was. The implication. I thanked her for her concern and hung up. That night I finally watched Daniel's video. He looked directly into the camera, calm and steady. If you're watching this, he said, it means I didn't get the chance to explain everything myself. I couldn't breathe. I love you, he continued. And I trust you. More than anyone. There are things my family doesn't need to manage. You'll know what to do. He smiled softly at the end, the kind of smile he used when he knew something others didn't. I sat there long after the screen went dark. They thought I was alone. They were wrong. Daniel had left me something far more powerful than money. He had left me clarity. And now I understood exactly what they were trying to take. Not just assets. Authority. The right to decide. And I was done letting them assume I would disappear quietly. Once you understand what someone is trying to take from you, fear loses its grip. That was the shift. I stopped waking up with that tight feeling in my chest. The one that made every phone call feel like a threat. I was still grieving. Grief doesn't disappear. But it no longer made me helpless. It made me careful. And careful people are dangerous to those who rely on chaos. I followed my lawyer's advice exactly. I stayed polite. I stayed quiet. And I let them keep talking. Eleanor continued organizing family meetings, without asking if I'd like to attend. Marissa continued emailing vendors and institutions, as if she were the primary decision-maker. They copied me on some messages. Not all. That inconsistency mattered. I began responding less but more deliberately. Short replies. neutral language. Always in writing. Always documented. And slowly something interesting happened. They started contradicting themselves. Eleanor told one bank that Daniel had wanted her to oversee everything temporarily. She told another that she was acting on behalf of the family. Marissa told a financial advisor that I was emotionally overwhelmed and preferred not to be involved. None of those statements were supported by anything, and professionals noticed that. The first crack appeared when a bank representative called me directly. "Mrs. Cole," she said carefully, "we've received conflicting instructions regarding one of your accounts. We need clarification." I thanked her calmly and asked for all correspondence to be sent to me and my lawyer moving forward. Her tone changed instantly. "Of course," she said. "We'll pause everything until that happens." Pause. That word scared them, because pauses invite scrutiny. Eleanor called me that evening. Her voice was tight, controlled. "Why are banks calling you now?" she asked. "Because I'm Daniel's wife," I replied. "And I've asked them to." She exhaled sharply. "We're just trying to help." "You've said that," I replied evenly. "But help doesn't require excluding me." There was a long silence. Then she said, "I think you're making this harder than it needs to be." That was the moment I knew they were losing ground. People who are in control don't accuse others of making things difficult. They don't feel threatened by questions. From that point on, I stopped being treated like an obstacle. I became a liability. They began reaching out more frequently, trying to reestablish warmth, checking in, offering support. Marissa even suggested lunch. I declined politely, because when manipulators sense exposure, they don't retreat. They try to reframe. And the reframe came quickly. They told extended family that I was pulling away, that I was hard to reach, that I was being influenced by outsiders. Outsiders apparently meant my lawyer. But now those stories landed differently, because people had started noticing the pattern. They noticed how quickly Eleanor moved into decision-making roles, how confidently Marissa spoke on matters she hadn't been part of before, how often they referenced Daniel's wishes without evidence, and people began asking questions. Quiet ones, professional ones, the kind that don't accuse but demand answers. Then came the meeting. Not one they arranged, one they were invited to. A formal sit-down with advisors and legal representatives to clarify responsibilities. Eleanor arrived composed, dressed for authority. Marissa followed close behind. They expected me to be nervous. I wasn't, because I wasn't walking in with emotion. I was walking in with documentation. When the questions started, I let them answer first. I listened as Eleanor spoke confidently about Daniel's intentions. Then I calmly placed Daniel's folder on the table. The drafts, the notes, the email correspondence, the video message. The room shifted. Not dramatically, but decisively. The lawyer across the table looked up at Eleanor. "Why weren't we made aware of these?" he asked. She opened her mouth, closed it. For the first time since Daniel died, she didn't have a rehearsed response. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain. I simply said, "Daniel trusted me with these." That was all. Because the truth doesn't need defending when it's finally in the right room. They didn't argue after that. They couldn't. Their strategy depended on silence, confusion, and my absence. And all three were gone. After that meeting, everything slowed down. Not because there was nothing left to do, but because control had shifted and everyone could feel it. Eleanor and Marissa stopped calling daily. They stopped checking in. They stopped making decisions without looping me in. Not out of respect. Out of caution. When people realize their version of events is no longer the only one in the room, they become very careful about what they say next. Banks froze actions until written confirmation. Advisors redirected questions to my lawyer. Emails that once went unanswered now received prompt, measured replies. And suddenly, I was no longer the emotional widow they could sideline. I was the legal point of contact. The consequences didn't come as punishment. They came as distance. Eleanor was no longer introduced as handling things. Marissa was no longer CC'd automatically. Family discussions stopped happening without me. Not because I demanded it, but because professionals demand clarity. And clarity exposes overreach. There was one final attempt. Eleanor invited me to her house just to talk. No lawyers. No paperwork. Just tea. I went. Not because I trusted her, but because I wanted to close the loop on my own terms. She looked tired. Not grief tired. Cornered tired. I don't understand why you pushed us away, she said softly. I let the silence stretch. I didn't push you away, I replied. I stepped forward. Her jaw tightened. We were trying to protect Daniel's legacy. I met her eyes. Daniel trusted me to do that. She didn't argue. Because she couldn't. That was the moment she understood something she had never expected to accept. I wasn't temporary. I wasn't confused. And I wasn't leaving. After that conversation they receded. Not dramatically. Not bitterly. Just quietly. Marissa stopped showing up unannounced. Eleanor stopped telling people what I would want. Their influence didn't explode. It dissolved. And I learned something important watching it happen. Power doesn't always disappear loudly. Sometimes it just stops being acknowledged. Life began to stabilize. I stayed in the house Daniel and I had built together. I rearranged things slowly, carefully, not to erase him but to make space for myself. I returned to work. I reconnected with people I drifted from during those heavy months. I slept through the night again. The grief was still there, but it was no longer tangled with fear. And that made all the difference. People sometimes asked how I managed to stay so calm through everything. The truth is, I wasn't calm. I was focused. I knew that reacting emotionally would only confirm the version of me they were trying to sell. So I let time, records, and consistency speak. And they spoke clearly. Daniel's family still exists in my life. At a distance. Cordial. Limited. Appropriate. Not because I hate them, but because trust, once broken in moments like that, doesn't come back in the same shape. And that's okay. Because I didn't need revenge. I needed recognition. Of my place. Of my marriage. Of my right to remain. And I got that not by shouting but by standing still. There's a strange moment that comes after everything settles. After the meetings end. After the calls stop. After the tension finally leaves your shoulders. It's the moment you realize you survived something you didn't think you would. For a long time I thought the hardest part of losing Daniel was the silence he left behind. The empty chair. The quiet mornings. The habits that no longer had a place to land. But I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing that in my most vulnerable moment, people I should have been able to trust saw an opportunity. Not to help me heal, but to move me aside. That truth hurt in a way grief alone never could. And yet it also changed me. Because once you see that clearly, you stop apologizing for taking up space. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were days when I still cried in the car. Nights when I reached for my phone just to remember his voice. Moments when the house felt too big and too quiet. But there was no longer fear underneath those feelings. No one was waiting to take something from me anymore. I handled Daniel's affairs slowly, carefully, with respect. I honored the life we built, not the version others wanted to rewrite. I made decisions without rushing. I said no without explaining. I learned that grief doesn't mean surrender. Eleanor and Marissa remained polite in the months that followed. Distant, formal, careful with their words. We were no longer a family unit. We were boundaries. And that was healthier for everyone. What surprised me most was how much strength I discovered in myself. Not loud strength. Not dramatic strength. Quiet strength. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. The kind that stands its ground without raising its voice. I used to think being kind meant being flexible. Being understanding. Letting things go. Now I know better. Real kindness includes yourself. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do, for yourself and for others, is refuse to disappear. If you're listening to this and you're in the middle of something similar, if you've lost someone or something and people are suddenly making decisions without you, hear this clearly. Grief does not cancel your authority. Pain does not erase your voice. And being quiet does not make you powerless. You don't need to fight everyone. You don't need to prove your worth emotionally. You don't need revenge that burns everything down. Sometimes the strongest justice is simply refusing to be removed from your own life. Daniel trusted me. And in honoring that trust, I honored myself. If this story resonated with you, Share your experience in the comments. Someone reading it might realize they're not weak. They're just surrounded by the wrong people. Like this video if you believe in quiet power. Subscribe to Revenge with Raina for more stories about dignity, emotional strength, and reclaiming your life without losing yourself. And remember, not all battles are won by force. Not all victories are loud. And not all revenge needs witnesses. Sometimes, peace is the proof that you won.